Hello everyone, today is Friday, September 27th, and the planet Mercury has recently ingressed into Libra, where the Sun is, and there is going to be an upcoming Cazimi, a forward motion Cazimi with Mercury and the Sun, which means that Mercury, which was previously in the morning star position, is going to cross paths with the Sun and enter its evening star phase. So that means the transition between what's considered a young Mercury into an old Mercury, which is more considered to be more mature or wise or learned from experience of in this Mercury cycle. Before then, eventually having a Mercury retrograde and then going the other direction, right? And what is interesting about this is that shortly after the Mercury Cazimi in Libra, we also have a solar eclipse in Libra, and this solar eclipse in Libra is significant because it's the each eclipse cycle happens on an 18 month period of time, and this will be the last eclipse in Libra as part of this 18-month cycle. I'm just noticing my cat looks like he wants to leave the room. My door is closed. I'm going to open the door for my cat. Okay, so I'm back. So we have the final eclipse of the Libra Aries eclipse cycle, and then we are on to Pisces and Virgo, of which has already begun since we had the lunar eclipse in Pisces recently. Now, there's something I have a plan, an idea in mind for this video that has multiple levels to it, right? Multiple layers to it. There is a political kind of level, or an ethical level, as well as what could be considered a metaphysical, a theological, or a philosophical kind of quality to it. And I have specifically in my mind, a while back, I made a video for the eclipse cycle, the eclipses in Libra, in which I was riffing off. I found one of my favorite bands of all time was The Fall, and there's a certain song by The Fall called Two Librans, and inspired by this song, I made a video called Three Librans, where I was using the idea of three historical Libran characters to kind of delineate the eclipse. And the ones that I picked were Margaret Thatcher, Michel Foucault, and R.D. Laing. And more recently, I have been getting into reading Friedrich Nietzsche, and Friedrich Nietzsche is also a Libran. And there's a certain kind of, obviously, a personal relevance around this, to do with, let's say, anti-psychiatry and radical mental health, which is something that I used to be more involved in the past. And I seem to keep bringing it up, and one of the things that I'm working out is this kind of like, do I need to just kind of move on from that, or is there actually something there worthwhile to be involved in? And recently, my interest in being involved in this is being kind of, I hate to say it, but it may be just reactive to what's going on in the politics, right? Like, just reacting against stuff you don't like in the political sphere, which is basically the call for more involuntary treatment. And last night I was just kind of feeling particularly a little bit irritated about this, so I wrote a couple posts on Facebook about it, And I've been considering maybe even just doing a video about it, but I have been, it's personal to me because when I was younger, back in 2012, I was put under an involuntary treatment order, and I found that to be very traumatizing. There's something about it where I have a strong opinions against involuntary treatment, and in the media, actually, you know what? To be fair, to be completely honest, CBC and the news media seems to be doing a somewhat decent job of like representing both sides of the argument, about representing arguments against this kind of push for more involuntary treatment. So I don't think it's like the media is totally unbalanced or anything like that, but it's a bit disappointing for one thing, that we're having an election here in BC, and that both of the political parties are like that you can vote for are basically unanimously agreeing that we need more involuntary treatment. So I'm going to go out and like support no matter who I vote for. I'm basically choosing a party where the party's line I basically don't agree with, right? And I don't have any representation for things that I feel strongly about in my politics, right? It's just completely unrepresented. It's completely outside the Overton window. It's completely outside what is considered like something valid that you can use as, but that's not to say that there isn't voices against this that are being represented in the media. There is some representation, but we don't have any political way to deal with it, right? And so, yeah, my point about this is not to get into all the nitty-gritty of the arguments against involuntary treatment, but, just to give you an example, some of those may be, like, for, I went through it because I was experiencing a mental health crisis, psychosis, and I went in and out of the psych ward a couple times, and in my own life, I have basically figured out that I don't have to worry about this so much anymore, because you seem to be only really like a target for involuntary treatment if you're in this position where you start being you're like a revolving door patient, where you're in the psych ward and you're out the psych ward and you're back in, and then you're like consistently if you can stay out of trouble, if you can stay out of getting picked up by the police, or if you can stay out of like getting locked up, then they're giving you more leeway as to not not be a target for involuntary treatment, right? And the thing is, they already have involuntary treatment, so it's kind of there's a kind of ambiguity over how are they going to expand this, or are they just going to try to take the same laws they have and try to apply them more often, right? But nonetheless, there's certain reasons of why, I made this video divinating what would be relevant around the eclipse, and I chose people like R.D. Laing, Michel Foucault, R.D. Laing being a person who was instrumental in the deinstitutionalization process, making an argument against having people locked up their whole lives in asylums and institutions. And Michel Foucault also famously, probably most famous for his thing where talking about prisons and hospitals and schools and just the institutions and the use of forced enclosure, forced confinement, right? And back when I was more involved with this stuff, I went to go see, there was a person who gave a talk at the Vancouver Public Library, which I was at, and I can even put it in the links and comments if you're interested, right? I usually put some links in my notes and references. I went to go to the Vancouver Public Library to see a woman named Tina Minkowitz give a talk about, what they call the total abolition movement, right? And she was a person who had a forced psychiatric hospitalization when she was, I think, 18 years old, and was maybe only in there for like 6 weeks or something. But this is the kind of thing, is that I'm just kind of reflecting on this, because in my own life, I always have this sort of struggle, like maybe I should just put this behind me and move on. But then I look at people like Tina Minkowitz, and she only had this happen, she was forced hospitalized as a teenager for 6 weeks, and that had enough of an impact on her to basically dedicate her whole life to becoming a human rights lawyer and to get involved from a kind of a top-down legislature point of view to make legalistic battles to fight for these forced treatment laws, right? So it's like there's this kind of thing that like people I get this sort of sense that like of feeling a little bit misunderstood by people who haven't been through it, where a lot of people are like, why don't you just like get over it and like just get on with it and where it's like when you look at other people who have done this, they dedicate their whole lives to fighting this, right? Because it's made that much of an impact on them, right? And they feel that strongly about it, right? And how many people do you know that feel that strongly about something that they're going to dedicate their whole lives to fighting this one thing, right? And the thing is, Tina Minkowitz was using, it's this kind of like a top-down legislative approach by working with the United Nations, and they had this thing called the CRPD, the Commissioner's Report on Persons with Disabilities, comparing forced psychiatric treatment with torture, comparing forced detainment with torture, comparing forced, keeping people locked up against their will, keeping people in seclusion against their will, keeping people confined against their will. And basically, Tina Minkowitz's argument is what she's trying to do is to create a system where you have, not just in psychiatry, but across the whole board, unlocked wards, right? And that basically anybody who's in hospital for anything should be able to just walk out if that's what they choose, right? Now, this could be, I admit that this might be a bit too extreme, I think, because there are obviously a lot of people who have things like dementia, who are, like, if these people were just, like, out wandering the streets getting in trouble, it would probably be a bit chaotic, right? So I can kind of, like, so this is the thing, is that there's a kind of, like, I can kind of, like, see how going in this one direction may be a bit extreme, and that you may be better to find some kind of middle ground, right? However, like this is kind of, I have this kind of frustration, or I haven't been involved in the scene, because what I notice is that this is the kind of like the polarization of politics, is that people become so polarized on these issues that they can't even talk to each other about it, right? And the people, especially, this is what I don't see enough I feel, like I was saying, the CBC, the media is doing a decent job of getting some of the message across against the involuntary treatment, but there's people who feel so strongly about this that they're not going to take it lightly. They're not, like, it's not okay. But how is this relevant to aside from the fact of like R.D. Laing and Michel Foucault being Librans? I'm applying this to the idea of the astrology right now, specifically because Mercury is the negotiator. Mercury is the mediator. Mercury was the god who was said to be able to go into Hades to deliver messages and then come out of Hades. Not many gods were allowed to do that. Mercury was. Mercury also stands for a kind of a shapeshifter between the genders. Mercury as being a kind of gender fluidity. Maybe Mercury was the queer god or something like that who could swing both ways, right? Maybe there's this whole sort of flexibility and fluidity with Mercury, and there was something that happened. I don't know. I think Mercury was making some kind of aspect to Uranus or something. There's some kind of thing going on, anyways. Where recently there was this a podcast that I watched called the Horseshoe Theory that had a popular episode featuring Hegelian e-girls that made a bit of a stir online. Although the thing is, I have to admit, I don't use Twitter or X as they call it, so I kind of just missed. What I do is I just hang out watching YouTube videos, and if anything happens on Twitter or X that's significant, I hear about it. Other people talk about it secondhand, and this is also relating to the fact that I have I guess I could say I have mental health challenges, and I think it's just probably better for my mental health not to be on Twitter, right? But there's necessarily this thing about like Mercury as being engaging in a kind of dialectic between both sides. But the thing is, I've never read any Hegel before, and so I'm not going to try to, put on that I am like an expert in the Hegelian dialectic, right? But I think there's something fundamental about this thing about what my experience of the radical mental health system. There's a certain friend that I have in that scene that was involved as an activist for years, like an old veteran in it, and she was saying that oftentimes you get this accusation that your point of view is too extreme, that you're unbalanced in your perspective. And then what she says is that you don't understand is that the way they do things is unbalanced, and we are the balance. We are the part of it that's left out, you're not listening to, and we have to be this really extreme thing to provide the balance for what gets left out of the conversation, right? So it's like, and I think there's something about the solar eclipse in Libra that fits that kind of aptly, that there's this like Libra is the balance, is the scales, and the eclipse is like the covering up, or the light kind of going out and then on again, of there being like, oh, everything is in this fine balance, and you're like, no, it isn't. There's this whole thing you're not listening to. There's a whole side of the conversation you're not paying attention to, and we just have to like. But the thing is, like, I didn't quite vibe with going that far of an extreme of an absolute to push for the total abolition movement, right? But there's this, in the way the politics are, is when you got a bunch of people who are just like stubbornly pig-headed about doing one thing one way, then like, what's better, to negotiate with them, to try to like strike a happy medium, or is it to like do this kind of like create such extreme polarization that you just, it doesn't even matter, or there's also this problem here in when I was living in Nanaimo, when I made friends with somebody from this whole scene of people who were caught up in the psych system and struggling with it and all that. And what was odd though was that she was kind of intersected into this, this community of psych survivors and, people who wanted to be like radical mental health activists that I was hanging out with in some way. But then when I started hanging out with this person's group of friends, obviously not everybody in the group of friends is like this, and you've got a bunch of people that have, different political points of view and stuff like that, who may not be sympathetic to this perspective, right? One of the things that I noticed about like hanging out, it got weird when COVID happened, because I started to see, it wasn't even necessarily in that group of friends, but just like, I was in Nanaimo, and one of the good things about Nanaimo was that there was a little music scene, there was, and I was living close to venues, and I could go out and do stuff and get involved in music events and stuff like that. But when I was like looking at people talking on the internet once COVID happened, especially like people who were like into DJing and in the dance music scene and all this, I started noticing people like saying, there's a lot of paranoia and suspicion and mistrust targeted at the United Nations as being some kind of like monolithic kind of control organization that's out to like place these like, laws on you and control your life. And I'm kind of like, I was just, I was literally like getting involved with like going to see people who are like human rights lawyers that were working with the United Nations to try to make the laws better to protect people against involuntary forced treatment, and that these people, it seemed, I don't want to make generalizations and paint everybody with the same brush, but the general attitude that I detected in the community around me was people who, for one thing, didn't like this idea of a top-down kind of bureaucratic or managerial lawmaking apparatus making laws on you that you don't have democratic control over or something. And at the same time, people are fed up with all the homeless people, fed up with all the drug addicts, and they want to lock them up. They want to just round up all these, people on the streets and just throw them away, lock them up without, throw away the key, and they're not really compassionate or sympathetic, right? Or at least that's not the vibe that I was getting, right? And it kind of creates this idea that, you could look at, there's this kind of conversation about, statistics, right? About evidence-based stuff, about, if you go by the statistics, people who are mentally ill are more likely to be victims of violent crime than the perpetrators of it. In Canada, apparently, this might be an old statistic because that was done back, a few years back. Maybe it's different now, but apparently, and I don't even, to me it doesn't make sense, because how do you, there might be some details on how this was done, how you get the data that you might have to look into, but it says that apparently 3% of the violent crime in Canada is committed by people who are mentally ill. So, if it's only 3% of the problem, then isn't that kind of, not really that worth investing that much money and resources in for the argument is that people are so afraid to go out that because of all these crazy mentally ill homeless people are going to be violent, and yet the statistics say it's only 3% of all violent crime, right? So it's are you going to go by some sensationalistic, media thing, or are you going to go by the numbers, right? And there's a sort of argument against the bureaucracy, against the managerial elite, that you're we're going to have some, a bunch of social justice warriors are going to pull some strings with the UN, and then they're going to take away our ability to just round up all the homeless people and throw them in the fucking, concentration camp or whatever, right? Now, yeah, that's the whole point. Yeah, we don't want you to do, we don't want to just be thrown in some fucking concentration camp, gulag, or mental health asylum, for what? For what exactly, right? Because, you're going to treat people, I don't know. I feel pretty strongly about this stuff. But there's, again, there's a sense of, I don't know, feeling kind of alienated, or, the community, or the one community that I'm getting involved with, and the other community just they don't see eye to eye, they don't get it, and they're being what do you do? Do you do a dialectic between one side and the other? Do you try to find some middle ground? Do you try to compromise? Do you try to try to create a balance? Do you try to is this what's fairness, right? What's justice here, right? What's this fair balance between one side and the other, and we strike a median point, and that's how we decide to do things, right? Is that what a dialectic is? Again, I've never read Hegel. I don't know anything about the dialectic. I'm just saying, but I'm just saying that I could at least see that one way of doing things was a bit extreme and that could have problems, and being that extreme about it goes with the prison abolition movement. People who want to abolish prisons, people who want to abolish all kinds of institutional confinement. And the reasoning goes is that it's not just about abolishing forced treatment. The main thing is that you have to abolish confinement, because you can't just lock somebody up and hold them there and detain them without letting them go until they comply with whatever you're trying to make them comply with, right? To make it so that's illegal just across the board, that you lock people up or detain them anywhere, basically. And I just find that that's a kind of extreme thing to push for, and that it kind of just makes more sense to try to find some kind of middle ground, right? But, which brings me to another kind of point here, is that, again, I've never read Hegel, but one thing I am reading is this book that I recently got, the Gilles Deleuze book on Nietzsche and philosophy. And I have to admit that I've been taking this approach recently where I've just started reading this, and I've had this idea to not. There's a lot of people that I find that are as soon as they start reading something, they have to talk about it, and I'm trying to take things that I'm reading and kind of sit with it longer and contemplate it longer. But I have to admit, this book, this is like a banger of a philosophy book. This is a good philosophy book. But I've read a bunch of Nietzsche before getting into this, at least a little bit. But there's this. I'm gonna read this part because I think this is, to me, it just seems like it all kind of like lines up, especially considering the conversation about like Laing and Foucault as Librans, Nietzsche as a Libran, and also you look at Nietzsche's astrological chart. Nietzsche has Mercury in the first decan of Libra, where Mercury is now. In Nietzsche's chart, Mercury is making an opposition to Uranus in Aries. So Nietzsche is a Libran with Mercury in Libra, just like we're having with this solar eclipse in Libra. And there's this kind of thing about Libra being the balance, you know, the where do you balance the scales between one side and another? And there's anyways. So this is, I'm gonna read this part, and just, I mean, I don't know. I haven't read the whole book, so you know, like, and I have to admit, I'm kind of an amateur with philosophy and all this kind of stuff. But I'm just going to I'm gonna get into it here and just read this part out, because I think this is particularly interesting given the whole situation. And I don't even know how this all adds up or anything, but for your consideration, I'm going to read this. Against the dialectic. Is Nietzsche a dialectician? Not all relations between same and other are sufficient to form a dialectic, even essential ones. Everything depends on the role of the negative in this relation. Nietzsche emphasizes the fact that force has another force as its object, but it is important to see that forces enter into relations with other forces. Life struggles with another kind of life. Pluralism sometimes appears to be dialectical, but it is its most ferocious enemy, its only profound enemy. This is why we must take seriously the resolutely anti-dialectical character of Nietzsche's philosophy. It has been said that Nietzsche did not know his Hegel, in the sense that one does not know one's opponent well. On the other hand, we believe that the Hegelian movement, the different Hegelian factions, were familiar to him. Like Marx, he found his habitual targets there. If we do not discover its target, the whole of Nietzsche's philosophy remains abstract and barely comprehensible. The question against whom itself calls for several replies, but particularly important one is that the concept of the overman is directed against the dialectical conception of man. The transvaluation is directed against the dialectic of appropriation or the suppression of alienation. Anti-Hegelianism runs through Nietzsche's work as its cutting edge. We can already feel in it the theory of forces. In Nietzsche, the essential relation of one force to another is never conceived of as a negative element in the essence. In its relation with the other force, which makes itself obeyed, does not deny the other or that which it is not. It affirms its own difference and enjoys this difference. The negative is not present in the essence as that from which force draws its activity. On the contrary, it is the result of activity, of the existence of an active force and the affirmation of its difference. The negative is a product of existence itself, the aggression necessarily linked to an active existence, the aggression of an affirmation. As for the negative concept, that is to say, negation as a concept, it is only a subsequently invented pale, contrasting image in relation to its positive basic concept, filled with life and passion through and through. For the speculative element of negation, opposition, or contradiction, Nietzsche substitutes the practical element of difference, the object of affirmation and enjoyment. It is in this sense that there is a Nietzschean empiricism. The question which Nietzsche constantly repeats, what does a will want? What does this one or that one want? must not be understood as the search for a goal, a motive, or an object for this will. What a will wants is to affirm its difference. In its essential relation with the other, a will makes its difference an object of affirmation. The pleasure of knowing oneself different, the enjoyment of difference. This is the new, aggressive, and elevated conceptual element that empiricism substitutes for the heavy notions of the dialectic, and above all, as the dialectician puts it, for the labor of the negative. It is... So this is the thing, is that, like, by doing this thing where you're, you can say that, like, you can affirm this thing of, like, the will not to be involuntarily treated, or the will not to have involuntary treatment expanded, right? That there's, like, some basic, or it could also put, like, or it could also be, look at the other side, the will to involuntarily treat people. You have to, like, if that is what you're affirming that you want more involuntary care, built into that is its own resistance. That topic, rather than creating an opposition, that whole thing has its own opposition built into it. By saying we're going to lock a bunch of people up who don't want to be locked up, that itself is the opposition, right? You don't have to create an opposition to that. The opposition is there in that thing, right? And so you could also say that if my will is to, like, just avoid that, I don't have to be in there's this thing, the labor of the negative, where on one hand you have these people that are trying to make laws with the UN to prevent countries like Canada from doing this, and that you have to, like, be like, oh, but there's all these people that in the community that don't understand, and so I have to act as a kind of a median where it's my cross to bear, basically, that I have to be torn in half, where, like, there's all these people who misunderstand me, and there's all these sort of, like, really politically absolute, really politically polarized people, and I have to put myself in the middle of this and do the labor of suffering to be like, all these people don't understand me, why don't you people listen, and all that, where you could also just not do this, right? You could also, like, which is kind of like, get off the cross, right? There's kind of like, you don't have to crucify yourself to suffer to make all these people who don't understand you. You could also just not do that, right? This is how I'm applying it to this situation, right? It is sufficient to say that dialectic is a labor and empiricism is an enjoyment. And who says that there is more thought in labor than in enjoyment? Difference is the object of a practical affirmation inseparable from essence and constitutive of existence. Nietzsche's yes, as opposed to a dialectical no, affirmation to dialectical negation, difference to dialectical contradiction, joy, enjoyment to dialectical labor, lightness, dance to dialectical responsibilities. The empirical feeling of difference, in short, hierarchy, is the essential motor of the concept, deeper and more effective than all thought about contradiction. So there's this kind of, like, basically the idea is that to contrast a kind of, like, being like Jesus suffering on the cross, where you have the vertical and the horizontal, you're putting yourself in the middle of this axis where you're suffering, to be like, there's all these people that I identify with, that I relate to, and all these people that I don't identify with, that I don't relate to, and I need to, suffer the passion to put myself in the middle of this conflict, and, to hopefully somebody's going to understand, or hopefully we can make some median, but I'm just going to suffer in the conflict of all this stuff. Whereas the other thing is, Nietzsche is like, you don't have to do this. You can affirm your own difference and live and affirm that difference joyfully. So they're living a kind of, and this is what the why the gay science is called the gay science, is that I'm not sure if it might be a bit complicated trying to talk about how empiricism works in this, but it's kind of a funny coincidence that if you take the empiricism of actually using the data of, like, well, rather than people's the beliefs and convictions that people hold. What if you just look at the data? Apparently the data says this is only 3%, you're making a big, you're trying to solve violent crime by scapegoating 3% of the population who are responsible. So the data is just, just leave it at the empirical data and live a happy life rather than putting yourself on the cross, right? I mean, maybe I'm telling myself this, right? But this is like, I'm working this out because these are new ideas to me, right? I'm getting into it, right? I don't know if I'm getting it right or not, right? But I'm approaching it anyways. The empirical feeling of difference in short hierarchy is the essential motor of the concept, deeper and more effective than all thought about contradiction. Furthermore, we must ask, what does the dialectician himself want? What does this will, which wills the dialectic, want? Is it an exhausted force which does not have the strength to affirm its difference? A force which no longer acts but rather reacts to the forces which dominate it? Only such a force brings to the foreground the negative element in its relation to the other. Such a force denies all that it is not and makes this negation its own essence and the principle of its existence. While every noble morality develops from a triumphant affirmation of itself, slave morality from the outset says no to what is outside, what is different, and what is not itself, and this no is its creative deed. This is why Nietzsche presents the dialectic as the speculation of the pleb and the way of thinking of the slave. The abstract thought of contradiction then prevails over the concrete feeling of positive difference, reaction over action, revenge and ressentiment take the place of aggression. And conversely, Nietzsche shows what is negative in the master is always a secondary and derivative product of his existence. Moreover, the relation of master and slave is not in itself dialectical. Who is the dialectician who dialectizes the relationship? It is the slave's perspective, the way of thinking belonging to the slave's perspective. The famous dialectical aspect of the master-slave relationship depends on the fact that power is conceived not as a will to power, but as a representation of power, representation of superiority, recognition by the one of the superiority, and of the other. What the wills in Hegel want is to have their power recognized to represent their power. According to Nietzsche, we have here a wholly erroneous conception of the will to power and its nature. This is the slave's conception. It is the image that the man of ressentiment has of power. The slave only conceives of power as the object of a recognition, the content of a representation, the stake in a competition, and therefore makes it depend at the end of a fight on a simple attribution of established values. If the master-slave relationship can easily take on the dialectical form, the point where it has become an archetype or a school exercise for every young Hegelian, it is because the portrait of the master that Hegel offers us from the start, a portrait which represents the slave, at least as he is in his dreams, as at best a successful slave. And underneath the Hegelian image of the master, we always find the slave. And this is, I've pointed this out before, that if you look at the people in our world who are images of the master, right? Let's take the people who are the most successful people, like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and all of that, that Elon Musk always projects this image of being a hard worker, right? That he is at the very top, he is at the highest level of elite, he has all this power to just buy platforms like Twitter and X, to move entire industry like SpaceX from California to Texas just because California has transgender laws that he doesn't like, right? You know, he has an immense level of power, but how does he present himself? He presents himself basically as a slave. Like, we got to do a lot of overtime. We know we're going to be up all night working. You know, I'm going to be there in the warehouse with all my employees, and I'm just a good. You know, I only got here because if you listen to Elon Musk's interview that he did with Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk spent a lot of time talking about how he likes America based because it's a meritocracy, right? That it's like apparently the better you are at being a slave, then you get to be the master, and the master is just a really good slave, right? The master is a slave who's been rewarded for being such a good slave, and so that is where these two things may not actually be. You know, if you look at where Elon Musk actually came from, he came from a wealthy family who had mines and power, and that he started with PayPal and had all this. You know, it's not that. You know, he came from a position of not being a slave himself, but being a master, an owner. And this image of a dialectic between master and slave, making the master have the same, the master is just a really successful slave, basically, right? There's this whole other dynamic. You know, I could just stop here, but there's this whole other thing going on that has to do, I mean, they didn't really get into it in that bit I read. And I'm not going to read any more right now, but there's some basic thing going on where if you look at applying this to astrology, bring it all back to astrology, right? Bring this all back to Greece, ancient Greece, the mythopoetic men's movement, the polytheistic mentality, the Hellenistic astrology, right? The Hellenistic period was a time of multiculturalism because for one thing, that you, instead of having monotheistic Christian deity, you had a pantheon of gods. You had also a multicultural dynamic between Greece, Rome, and Egypt, where the Greek mythology was incorporated by the Romans, and the Greeks and the Romans both had a relationship to the Egyptians where they respected the Egyptian religion, and even though they had different gods and they had different stories, there are a lot of people who sensed some underlying coherence between the Greek myths and the Egyptian myths. And there was born out of this a kind of Alexandrian Hellenistic religion where the worship of like the goddess Isis made itself overseas, where you had Isis cults outside of Egypt, that you had this kind of, and this is all predating Christianity, right? Now there's something specifically about this where, from a Christian perspective, right? And I'm just exploring this. I don't even know exactly which side I take on this, so I'm not going to make an argument for one over the other. But I'm just going to lay it out neutrally, because this is just an idea that I've been playing with, anyways, right? From a Christian perspective, you have one monotheistic God who represents the good, or like the Platonic ideals of the good, the beautiful, the true. You have God is good, right? The one total God is good, but then in contrast to that, human beings are lowly sinners, basically, right? And all of Christianity, especially Catholicism, is based around this kind of confession of like confessing your sins, or being aware of your own lowly human nature. And even if you don't get into the religious side of it, you still have to deal with it in terms of your own mortality, right? And I think this is like, especially when we're talking about Nietzsche, I think it's a kind of a pointed example, because there's all this stuff that Nietzsche was talking about, and Nietzsche's ideas unfortunately got used by the Nazis, probably in a way that Nietzsche himself, would not align with, I would say, right? But there are strains of all this problematic stuff, obviously, in Nietzsche anyways. But there's something, I had this thought that maybe humans can't live forever, not just because it'd be too much on the body or something, but I have this idea that humans can't handle that much history. Like somebody like Nietzsche wouldn't be able to handle seeing his ideas being used by the Nazis, then the world wars, and then the bombs, and then Nietzsche that'd be too, it's too much for one human soul to handle all that history, right? So like even if you take out that, I think there's a sort of like, in dealing with your own finitude, in dealing with your own mortality, we can say that we are not infinite beings, right? We are mortal humans, and our human nature is, we make all kinds of mistakes and create all kinds of problems and do all kinds of things which would be considered ungodly or undivine, right? But so what the other side of that, though, is that there's a thing that Nietzsche argues for, or if you take, rather than this monotheistic God, or God as the good and humans as these lowly sinners, that there's something in the Hellenistic or mythological perspective where the gods aren't good. The gods are actually kind of assholes in the myths, right? I'm not going to make any specific, I'm not going to go into all the examples, but there are plenty of examples where the gods are, there's all these human attributes, and that the gods are in some way kind of like strange exaggerations of things that humans do, right? In the sense that when it kind of goes with this archetypal thing, that if you look at patterns, right, that you could look at, you could identify patterns that we value, as in like the classical, like God itself, the Christian God is built around this thing of a strong father figure, right? That you have some strong father figure with moral values of what is good and all this, and that, just as we relate to our Father who's here to raise us and teach us these lessons, there is the Father of all, the King of Kings, the Father of Fathers, the archetypal King Father, the image that makes the Christian God or whatever. That, or you could say like the wise old man, or the teacher, right? Or the strong warrior, all these different like archetypes that we value, right? But in the Greek gods, that the Greek gods are often getting into all kinds of trouble. There are all these patterns, like just as there are patterns that we celebrate in human existence, there are all these patterns that get us into trouble, and that the myths more often than not are these cautionary tales of these reoccurring human patterns that get us into trouble. But the thing is, the idea in the Greek mythology is that the thing that gets us into the most trouble is hubris, right? That the human gets into trouble by thinking that he is better than the gods, or making the gods jealous of you, right? There's this whole thing about like, if you are a person, if the Venus, the god of beauty, if you start making yourself so beautiful that you think that you could compete with Venus, Venus is gonna be pissed. And Venus is all, Venus is all about love and harmony, all this kind of stuff. In the like, this is like the Eros and Psyche, right? Or the golden ass, right? That if Psyche starts off as a human who ends up becoming one of the gods, right? That the human psyche is beautiful and finds its own, the human psychology or the human soul finds its own godliness. But in doing so, you get the gods angry at you, because the gods are like, hey, you are a human, you should stay down there with the humans, and if you're getting more attention, the human is getting more attention than the gods are going to be pissed with you, basically, right? But so this is kind of thing that the gods are jealous. The gods themselves get into sort of all sorts of shenanigans and trouble, and the gods don't like it when human beings have hubris, right? And there is this whole idea that in this perspective, it's actually kind of like there's nothing wrong with being human. There's nothing fundamentally wrong or sinful about being human, but there's something about by trying to be like, it's almost like tall poppy syndrome or something, right? By trying to be too godly, we go astray, we stray off into this territory that's not really meant for us, and we get punished for it, right? So it's actually, which is kind of what I'm just saying. This is kind of like like in the Christian thing. Christianity, God is good and God is perfect, and we feel all lowly and sinful because it's impossible for us to meet this high ideal of what the Christian God is, or even somebody like Jesus. You're supposed to imitate Jesus, and we all fail at imitating Jesus, so we're all lowly sinners. Whereas from the Greek mythological perspective, it's like there's nothing actually really wrong with being human, but it's in trying to either, being so much of a hero that you're more of a hero than Hercules, or so beautiful that you're more beautiful than Venus, or it's our own hubris of trying to be godly that gets us into trouble because we start straying into an area that's not for us, right? That we have to stay with our human lives embodied in them, or that there's nothing really. The gods themselves are kind of like these kind of patterns that have crystallized around human excess, or these patterns of human intensity, right? These stories of tragedy, these stories of drama, these really intense things that humans do, that these things that play out over and over and over again. It's like it becomes a tragic, awful thing because we don't learn our lesson that it's better just to be human, right? But which is an inversion of the Christian thing, where it's actually it's like wretched, lowly thing that you have to repent for being human. Whereas it's like these things are two kind of opposites that play off each other, right? And there's some sort of similarity with the classic anime series Neon Genesis Evangelion, where the angels in Evangelion are like the kaiju monsters in like Godzilla, or these other, Japanese, where you have the big monsters that come and attack the city, right? The divine in Neon Genesis Evangelion, it's very flat out apparent that the divine is something that's hostile to human life, right? And that instead of being like trying to, like, there is a war going on between heaven and earth, right? And it's presented in this way. Neon Genesis Evangelion is brilliant because it's presented in a way where at the beginning of the series, it's just a mecha anime robot fighting monster show, and it's just a kind of a quirk that the monsters are called angels, right? They could just be aliens. They could just be like War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, alien invaders, and not using the word angel, and not that much would be. It's only later into the show when they start getting into it, right? But there's this sort of basic, and there's this also, we see this problem with like UFO stuff, and this whole conversation of like, are they aliens? Are UFOs just advanced human military technology that's kept secret? Are the UFOs like, Chinese weather balloons, or are they like, advanced Chinese spy equipment? And there is no alien from outer space. There is no supernatural angel. The UFO is just a human thing, right? It's all just in this this kind of rational, nuts and bolts, scientific kind of thing. Or is it an alien from outer space? Or is it, or are the aliens the fairy, the divine, like some sort of breaking through of some, paranormal force, some extraordinary force, right? And that's all there in Neon Genesis Evangelion. But there's this whole thing that like in the Christian. Well, what's also kind of funny is that if you go into the Old Testament, God isn't very nice. God is kind of maybe more like these angels in Neon Genesis Evangelion, where God isn't like, buddy Christ, like you're God, Jesus loves you and all this kind of stuff. No, they're like, there's some kind of a war between the earthly realm and the heaven realm, and that there's nothing really wrong with being a human being. It's just that like for some reason when the mortal, human, finite intersects with the immortal, unhuman, infinite, there's a certain violence that happens there. That's not very good, right? And that Christianity takes that violence and puts Jesus right in the middle of it, and saying that Jesus puts himself on the center of that cross between heaven and earth, suffering for our sins so we don't have to do it. So Jesus put himself on that cross so we don't have to. So there you go. I have gone from radical mental health activism, involuntary treatment, to reading from Nietzsche, to talking about some metaphysical, theological stuff with Neon Genesis Evangelion. Thank you for watching. Please tune in next time. Thanks for all your support. Have a good day. And good luck with this eclipse.